Okay, so I've come to the conclusion that God has forgiven me and that I need to forgive others, but to tell you the truth, I just don't really want to. And see, now I feel guilty and condemned because I'm still holding on to anger or a grudge towards another, even though God has forgiven me of so much. Why can I not forgive? Yet if I was to move forward, I would simply be complying to what God tells me to do. But inside, my heart doesn't want to forgive, and consequently, Jesus had really harsh words for those that lived as hypocrites. See, where on the outside they looked one way, but on the inside they were totally different. In fact, Jesus said to them in Matthew 23 and 25, he said, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, and you hypocrites! For you clean the outside of your cup and the plate, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgences. You blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and the plate, that the outside may also be clean. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites! For you are like whitewashed tombs, which outwardly appear beautiful, but within are full of dead men's bones, and all uncleanness. So you also outwardly appear righteous to others, but within you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness." See, so I come to the crossroads when it comes to forgiveness. I want to forgive others, but the hurt and the pain that I have is so real, and it's keeping me from truly desiring to love them and to forgive them. So what's a man to do? What's a person to do? I would start right where Paul would. He had this wonderful little four-word statement. He says, "Do you not know?" See, many of us try to live the Christian life. We try to do our best to be good. We try not to be bad. We try and love others. We try. Yet in doing so, we seem never to reach the finish line. It keeps moving one step away. As we get closer, it moves a step closer. And the truth is, we're getting worn out from this trying. Well, the truth is that you can't live the Christian life, and you should stop trying to do so today, right this second. I bet you never heard that one before. In fact, you can ease your shoulders back, take a breath, and feel the rest that comes from just accepting that you must stop trying to live this Christian life. God never intended for you to do that. And even if you've heard this week after week that you need to try harder from the pulpit, that you need to buck up, that you need to do better, well, it was a mistake coming right from the pulpit of many churches today. See, God wants to live the Christian life in you and through you, and only He can. And anytime you try to live that by your own flesh or by your own power, failure is yet to follow. And yet when you trust Him to live in you and through you, victory will start to be the norm in your life. See, on the cross, you died and were recreated as a new creation. And you might say, "Oh, I've known that verse. It's been one of my favorites," but maybe you didn't know what that completely meant. See, you were not only created as a new creation, but God is so good, He didn't leave it just there. He came to live inside you. There is no more separation between you and God. You have been, now that's past tense, reconciled to God, and you are now one spirit, a participant in this divine nature. Look at a couple verses, yet they're all over the New Testament that talk about this union that you now have with Christ. Galatians 2:20 is many people's favorites. It says, "I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who dwells in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God, who loved me and gave Himself for me. Now I am in union. I was co-crucified with Christ. It's not I who live, it's Christ who lives in me." That's why he says in Philippians, it's Christ in me is the hope of glory. 2 Peter 1:4 says, "Now this divine power has been granted to us that pertains to life and godliness, and that through them you may become partakers of that divine nature." And 1 Corinthians 6:17 is a short one, but one of my favorites. It says, "But he who is joined to the Lord becomes one spirit with Him." Okay, so maybe you didn't know this, and now we're going past this. Do you not know? This is a big thing. This is a huge thing, because so many times we've seen that, okay, God saved me, and now there's this separation, so I got to go out and I got to live the best that I can. I got to try, and I just keep getting worn out. And the truth of what Christ said, that I came to Him for rest, well, that seems to be a lie. Truth is, you can't live the Christian life and you must stop trying to do so and start trusting Him to do so in you. So don't beat yourself up. For many years, I even tried to live the Christian life, only to fail and to fail again. To the point, at one point in my life, taking my Bible, throwing it across the bed, and saying, I give up. I can't do it any longer. And on that day, when I repented of my strength to try to live this Christian life, and I received His strength to do it, well, I honestly think that there was a party in all of heaven. They finally said, finally, he gets it. He can't do it. It has to be me that does it in him. Luke 15 has 3 parties when there was true repentance, when they finally figured out they couldn't do it on their own, that it had to be the Father doing it in them. Now, let me go back to that forgiveness thing, since that was the subject at hand. It is God's nature to forgive. And you, my friend, now share in that very nature. This is God's nature from the beginning of the book. Think of Adam and Eve when they took of the fruit. What was God's thing to do? Is to come, to walk in the cool of the garden, to forgive them, to actually clothe them, even after they had lived independent of Him. I love how Daniel puts it in Daniel 9:9. It says, to the Lord our God belongs mercy and forgiveness. See, forgiveness belongs to God. It comes from God directly to flow into the heart of the believer that is now unified with God, and then to flow out of the heart. We become vessels of this righteousness, containers. That's what a vessel is. It's a container of righteousness. And now that forgiveness flows right through us. It's not a matter of being forced, and I gotta forgive, but it becomes a very fluid motion for the believer. Forgiveness belongs to God, as does mercy, tender loving kindness. And now you and Him are one spirit. So He wants you to have it. He wants it to flow through you. You don't try to get it. To do so would be to live in unbelief. To live a belief separation from God, that you have to do that on your own power. No, you trust Him to do it in you and through you, and you rest in who He says you now are. See, when we sin against another, guilt comes into our conscience to alert us that something is now amiss. And this leads us to reconcile that relationship and to ask for forgiveness when we have wronged another person. Yet when we are sinned against, hurt comes. Much of the Christian life tells us how to deal with sin that we have done, but doesn't tell us how to deal with sin that has been done against us, and how we can now forgive others that have sinned against us. See, if we don't, that hurt can fester and cause shame and resentment and many other fleshly responses. The reason? Because we try to handle it independent of God instead of dependence upon Him. See, much of our past is marred by these hurts. Out of the shame, they become the drivers of our life and even drive us when we aren't even aware. And instead of dealing with the root of what is now driving the behavior, we start trying to manage the sin that ultimately results from the behavior. And we start this downward spiral of sin management, which is just a wonderful oxymoron, because we can never manage sin. Only God can heal that sin. So what should I do? First things first, we need to rest in who we now are and consider that to be true. I think the King James has it as to reckon this to be true, or to consider. It's actually an accounting term that says, add all these things up. Yet you have died with Christ, you were buried with Him, and now you've been raised with Him, and you can live in resurrection power, in His Zoe life in you, instead of just your own best attempts at trying to do better. Even if you are still trying to forgive in your own strength, you are destined for failure. See, if you can get forgiveness out of your mouth, well, the root of it will still produce sprigs in the future. But God Himself can heal those wounds that drive you, if you will allow Him. This book, Truefaced, by Bill Thrall, Bruce McNichol, and John Lynch, has some wonderful principles in it. Let me see if I can get that title in there. There it is, Truefaced. Whoa. All right. And matter of fact, this thing is really just selling like hotcakes. So, if you can get a copy, man, run to Amazon right now or go to truefaced.com to get a copy of it. I think it's actually become quite a phenomenon in Shanghai, West Virginia. But honestly, there are wonderful principles. There are 7 things that they talk about when they speak about forgiveness. Let me just read you some of the notes that I made on it, as I think it could be helpful. But go out and get the whole book, because I'm just giving you a snippet. Now, the work has to be done. And we get to partake in this work by God's nature in us. We get to have this flow coming through us, and then He heals the wounds inside us. Anytime we try to heal these wounds, it's just good old pop psychology. Self can never heal self, but God, the creator of all, can heal it. The first thing that they say in the book is to admit that something happened. Acknowledging a hurt is not the same as healing that hurt. In many ways, it can be worse because the remembrance of those sins against us can manipulate and drive our lives. Yet God's provision for healing begins with a recognition that someone has sinned against you. We must not allow lies to keep us from admitting that something has happened, like, well, this shouldn't bother me, or I should be over this by now. These are all ways we try to manipulate sin and manage sin by our own means instead of trusting God with this sin. This is an invitation to stop hiding the sin that someone else has done against me. To forgive, we must admit that which has already happened to us. The second principle is forgive the consequences of the act done against you. Many times the consequences of the act done against us are worse than the act itself. For instance, being beaten up by some neighborhood kids, then taking the feeling of helplessness and weakness and living out of that in your life. These consequences have a daily effect on your life and motivate you to live in usually one way or another. And these are notes from me here, not from the book. Then number one, to avoid the pain of what that shame tells us, we react against it and prove that what it is telling us is not true. So in that weakness of being bullied and beaten up, we then become the bully to prove that we're not weak. Then we start to bully, and it becomes this whole cycle. Now, or number two, it keeps God and others out of the place where the pain lives. Thus, we can never trust God or others with who we truly are. And we begin wearing a mask to hide the shame and the pain. We begin to self-medicate that instead of allowing others and allowing God into that area. Many people find it helpful to write down the incidents and what actually happened and how it impacted their life, and to get in touch with how it felt as a result of the event. And I'll tell you personally, I wasn't going to do this part of it. I was just breezing through and reading the book more as a textbook instead of a book that to really impact my life. In fact, as a teacher and as a pastor, I felt, I got this part covered, I don't need to do this. But I went ahead and took the time to do it. I really felt God was dealing with me on a very specific incident that happened when I was 10. So I decided, well, let me go ahead and start writing some of these things down. And as I did, the flow of it just came out of me. It's stuff that I had been pulling back and strongholding from God for years. Some of the questions that they have in the books to ask as you're doing these things would be, did I experience shame? Did I become fearful? Did I feel demeaned and devalued? Did anger and resentment begin to grow within me? Did I feel manipulated? Was I shunned? Were there relational effects? Did I lose things because of living out of the lie and shame of this? For instance, like a marriage, friends, my children, my job. Has this sin led to a change in my outlook or attitude towards life? See, harboring that sin enables the sin that was committed against us to define us. Unresolved sins are buried alive, including the ones done against us. Number 3, pour out your heart to God and tell Him what happened to you. I know this may sound ridiculous because you'll say, well, God already knows. He's omnipresent. He's omniscient. Yeah, He knows all these things. No, this is not for His sake. It's for yours. One of some of the notes on there, it says, once we acknowledge what happened and how it affected us, we must pour out our hearts to God, telling Him everything about what happened to us. We might think that we should be past this and that any rehearsal of the event is akin to wallowing in it, but that's not true. Protecting the sin and shame from God keeps Him out of the area that only He can heal and bring truth into. Number 4, forgive the offender for your benefit. This is where we initiate the vertical transaction with God for our benefit. This is not of ourselves, but this this can only happen because of the finished work of the cross and because Christ lives in us. It is helpful to see ourselves lifting this sin and all of the consequences to God, to see us laying the entirety at the cross. We must trust that God is big enough to have done this, to have done the work in us, and relying upon his finished work, he sets us free. And take a look at the notes on John 8:31 through 36. In doing this, we move the thoughts, feelings, judgments, and resulting pain from our sphere and into God's trust, into God's, trusting him with his ability to bring love and reconciliation for the person into our hearts. That's a main point. We have to trust God that he will bring this love and reconciliation into our hearts. If we don't do this, forgiveness stays within the mind only and never cleans the inside of the heart, never gets to the recesses of the heart. A few of the other ones on there are: forgive the offender when they repent for their sake, distinguish between forgiving and trusting your offender, and seek reconciliation, not just conflict resolution. Like I said, the book that this come out of is Truefaced by Bill Thrall, Bruce McNichol, and John Lynch. I highly recommend getting this. I mean, if you're in Shanghai, West Virginia, you'll probably have no chance of it, But anyway, this is not an infomercial for the book, but it is to show where you can find a lot of great information that can actually heal a lot of the hurts. Maybe I'll get a commission. No, I probably won't get a commission. Maybe just a signed headshot from John Lynch. Yeah, that would be commission enough. Thank you guys for watching. For more of these videos, you can go to promisedgrace.com. That's promisedgrace.com.